Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classics lecture number 40. This one is covering the Harvard Classics lecture volume number 5, and the lecture is Emerson's essay, Compensation. Now, we're going to have more to say about this title in a little bit because it's a little bit kind of complicated exactly what Emerson is talking about. If you haven't been studying with me, I recommend that you go to my website, learnstrong.net, go down that left-hand side and find the folder called Harvard Classics, and for sure watch Lecture 35, which is my intro to Emerson. Lecture 36, I did American Scholar. 37, I did Divinity School Address. 38, I did Man the Reformer. And then my last lecture, 39, was Self-Reliance. Now, I want to remind you that as we are playing this game together of studying Ralph Waldo Emerson's famous essays, we're looking at Emerson from three different perspectives. Emerson as human and man. Here we're concentrating more on his biography and the experiences of his life that inform so much of what he writes about. Then we'll see Emerson as philosopher, idealist, called often transcendentalist, although he himself didn't always like that term. And then finally Emerson as artist or creator. And here we're looking primarily at not what Emerson says, but how he says it. He is a craftsman with language, and we want to point that out. Now, just to remind, we define learning in 303 as the capacity to connect new information to old information. You're always seeing this with the great writers and the great artists, and we're certainly seeing this already often in our earlier topics and studies of Emerson. We're certainly going to see it in this essay called Compensation. Our three levels of reading to remind. We're always working to try to read on three different levels. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? Here at 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, rhetoric. That's that thing we were talking about before. Not what the writer says, but how the writer says it. And then finally, at level 3A, how do I relate to this text that I'm studying? At 3A, how do I relate this to other texts and to the world around me? And then finally at 3B, and most importantly, how do I relate this to myself? As I've said in earlier lectures about Emerson, don't just read this guy because somebody told you he's important and therefore just follow along and believe it. No. We want to read and we want to critique. We want to read and we want to appreciate. Right? And of course at 3B, we want to try and somehow own the text. That is to say and learn something about the text that matters to us. Now, background information here, 1841 is the year that this one is published. And what is this essay about? Well, I think there's at least 3 or 4 things that we want to pay attention to in our notes as we get ready to study this essay together. First of all, let's pay attention to the age-old question, is life fair? And by fair here we mean, is it the case that the good guys win and the bad guys lose? Right? Is life fair? Now, of course, our lectures on Plato's Republic redefine this question as, is life just? And what is justice? What does it mean to be just? Now, Emerson is assuming that readers of this essay have some prior knowledge, like, for example, they are aware of the arguments to the Thrasymachon question of Plato's Republic. Now, if you haven't been with me for those lectures, I recommend that you go find those on Learn Strong in the AP folder, I believe, and just kind of scroll down. I've also given lectures for the Harvard Classics on Plato as well, although not Republic, and we'll be coming back to this idea about compensation or justice in the universe. The quest for balance and for harmony is going to show Emerson's appreciation and love of what back then they called Oriental texts, non-American texts, non-Western texts. Primarily, he's usually referencing when he talks about these texts as early Buddhist and Hindu thought. And Emerson kind of often confused the two. Of course, they're not the same thing. But there are strands of thought there that are going to sound very similar. Obviously, Buddhism is a departure from Hinduism, right? In the same way that Christianity is in many ways a departure from Judaism, we might say. But for Eastern thought, if you know anything about that yin-yang symbol that, for example, we lecture and talk about when we did William Blake, the great romantic poet, this idea that symbol represents, out of ancient Chinese Taoism, that symbol represents the notion of the harmony and the balancing of nature. That's going to be fundamentally the concept of compensation as Emerson is talking about it in this essay. The idea of karma, that you don't get away with anything, and in the end there's payback for everything. Fundamental to as well appreciating and reading this one as well. There's an understanding of a certain dualism that we'll play with as well here, right? If there's any good, there has to be evil, in other words, all right? Finally, we mentioned the word theodicy when we were doing our Milton study, the existence of evil in the world. Why do bad things happen to good people is a fundamental question. It takes us all the way back to our study of Voltaire and, of course, the great Lisbon earthquake that produced his classic Candide, and Leibniz's answer that this is the best of all possible worlds created by an all-powerful deity, an all-loving deity. That, of course, is as well the project of Milton to justify the ways of God to men, as we talk about in earlier lectures for the Harvard Classics on Paradise Lost. I think that this is a real serious question for Emerson the man, who lost his wife, first wife, lost his son Waldo, and had to come to terms with what it means to deal with death. And I think standing behind a lot of what's said in Compensation is this discussion about theodicy. Can you explain the fact that bad things happen in this world? Now, let's work level 1. As I said before, I'd love to just be able to read the entire essay for you out loud, but I can't. I don't have the time. So I recommend that on your copy you number. There are 50 paragraphs in this essay. I'm going to work through them quickly with you. I do recommend that you follow along and that you have your own copy. Now, although the Harvard Classics doesn't publish Compensation with a poem, there is often a poem of Emerson's that is published along with this essay. And we'll go ahead now and quickly just turn to that. I won't read all of it, but I will read you the opening 4 or 5 lines. It reads like this. The wings of time are black and white, pied with morning and with night. Mountain tall and ocean deep, trembling balance duly keep. In changing moon and tidal wave, glows the feud of want and have. In other words, 2 things to point out here. The idea of balance or harmony central, and the idea that there's always 2 parts to this world that we live in. There's desire, and of course, there's the actual fulfilling of those desires, want and have. Emerson will begin. Paragraph number 1, he says, he's always wanted, since he was a young boy, to write an essay on this topic of compensation. But it's not real clear what he means by compensation, and so he gets to paragraph number 2, and as Emerson often will do, and we want to put this in our notes at 2B already, Emerson likes to build from an experience that he's had. He'll go from the simple to the complex is the way that we often will say it, right? So he starts out with just a little story. I was lately confirmed in these desires of wanting to write an essay on this topic by hearing a sermon in church. The preacher, a man esteemed for his orthodoxy, unfolded in the ordinary manner the doctrine of the Last Judgment. He assumed that judgment is not executed in this world, that the wicked are successful, that the good are miserable, and then urged from reason and from Scripture a compensation, the origination of the title, to be made to both parties in the next life. No offense appeared to be taken by the congregation at this doctrine. As far as I could observe, when the meeting broke up, they separated without remark on the sermon. And now to the 3rd paragraph. He says it, the statement of the problem. And the statement of the problem is, what about this issue of rewards? Now, this takes us back to, of course, the question from Plato's Republic, as we've lectured it already, the question of the myth of Gyges in Republic 2. You'll maybe remember there that Glaucon will ask the question of Socrates about the myth of Gyges, the young shepherd who finds the ring that makes him invisible. The Lord of the Rings fans, the Tolkien fans know this story as well, of course. And what is it that he does when he gets this ring that makes him invisible? He gets to go and do great things for other people and not be known. No, that's not what he does. What he does is he does terrible nasties with the ring because he can get away with it. And the obvious question of the myth of Gyges, by the way, I teach it as the myth of Maverick, that question of why should I give the money back in the myth of Maverick story that I lecture elsewhere? Money falls to the floor. I'm working at a Maverick at a gas station. Money falls to the floor and the individual woman who dropped it doesn't see it. Why should I ever give the money back if I'm not worried about some kind of punishment if I don't give it back, either in this life or the life to come, or if I'm not wanting a reward? In other words, I give the money back and she gives me half of it or something like that. That's the question that Glaucon asks Socrates in Republic 2. We talk about that there. I believe that much of this essay has that story and that question of Glaucon and the myth of Gyges standing right behind it. The issue, of course, is where is the reward for good behavior in this life? Or does it only happen in the afterlife in a Christian understanding of a judgment day or something like that? Well, because Emerson doesn't believe in an afterlife with a judgment day and a heaven and a hell, then he obviously has to make the argument, and this is the first central thing you want to write down in your notes. He obviously is going to make the argument that there is compensation, that is to say payback, in this life, and actually only in this life. Okay? Paragraph 4, he talks about the real central issue. What constitutes success, right? And of course, the theodicy question here is also raised, right? In other words, okay, so why is it that somebody who does good deeds can have bad things happen to them? And why is it that somebody who does bad deeds can get away with it and can gain all kinds of notoriety and power? It's an interesting question, right? Paragraph 5, he says it. Men are wiser than they know. This is Emerson's fundamental assumption that he believes to be true. Okay? Paragraph 6, he gets to the thesis itself. He will call it the law of compensation. And now we turn to paragraph number 7, and we'll begin here with his opening remarks about what really compensation is. Polarity, dualism, black and white, if you will. Think of the yin-yang symbol, and immediately that idea, that symbol will represent what he's saying here. Polarity, or action and reaction, we meet in every part of nature. In darkness and light, in heat and cold, in the ebb and flow of the waters, in male and female, in the inspiration and expiration of plants and animals, and so on. He finishes, to empty here, you must condense there. An inevitable dualism bisects nature, so that each thing is a half and suggests another thing to make it whole, as spirit matter, man woman, subjective objective, in out, upper under, motion rest, yea nay. So in the 7th paragraph, he finally gets to what it is that he is going to argue. And what is it that he's going to argue? Let's put it in our notes already so then we can be looking for it as we come to actually this essay. All of nature is balanced. There is always an A and a B. But Hegel will argue in his Hegelian synthesis, there is a thesis, an antithesis, and then of course the two, this is where he gets his term dialectic, borrowing it from Plato of course, the two struggle or compete against each other to produce a synthesis, which then in turn becomes the new thesis with its obvious antithesis. That's going to be fundamental to understanding how we read this essay. Let's go quickly now through the next paragraphs. Paragraph 8, he talks about the ebb and flow of nature and the dualism that is inevitably there. Paragraph number 9, he talks about the mechanic forces that are involved. History and climate, for example, will prove the same kind of dualism. There is always a give and there is always a take. And then in paragraph number 10, he will say the same dualism underlies the nature and condition of man. Every excess causes a defect, every defect an excess. Every sweet has its sour, every evil its good. Every faculty which is a receiver of pleasure has an equal penalty put on its abuse. It is to answer for its moderation with its life. For every grain of wit there is a grain of folly. For everything you've missed, you have gained something else. And for everything you gain, you lose something. And we'll pause here at 3a already, and we'll be doing this a lot through the reading of compensation. But of course, for those of you that know that Ecclesiastes passage from the Bible, there is a time for every season, a time for peace, a time for war. This reading, of course, sounding very much like this. If riches increase, they are increased that use them. If the gatherer gathers too much, nature takes out of the man what she puts into his chest, swells the estate, but kills the owner. Nature hates monopolies and exceptions. Paragraph number 10, there's always some leveling circumstance. Paragraph 11, power and place are matters of perspective. And then in paragraph 11, he has this really remarkable observation about a farmer versus the president. And of course, we think about Lincoln and his comments about what it is that's different between the two. Paragraph 11. The farmer imagines power and place are fine things, but the president is paid dear for his White House. It has commonly cost him all his peace and the best of his manly attributes. To preserve for a short time so conspicuous an appearance before the world, he's content to eat dust before the real masters who stand erect behind the throne. This is a compelling idea. The farmer looks at the president and says, man, it'd be nice to have all that money, power, etc. And Emerson says, you know, you got to see the whole picture. And that's central to this essay, seeing the whole picture. The president is the president, but boy, oh boy, has it been hard on his life. Think about all the things that a man or woman who run for president and win, think about all the stuff that those people have to give up. In other words, again, there's a balance. Paragraph number 12, he says cities and nations have the same kind of situation. He says it this way: if the government is cruel, the governor's life is not safe. If you tax too high, the revenue will yield nothing. If you make the criminal code sanctuary, juries will not convict. Nothing arbitrary, nothing artificial can endure. In other words, he says, in the world of politics and in the world of nations, you will see this very thing happening. Paragraph number 13. These appearances indicate the fact that the universe is represented in every one of its particles. Everything in nature contains all the powers of nature. Everything is made of one hidden stuff. Now this takes us back to an earlier observation that we were making about that two-box view, as we were talking about it in an earlier lecture on Emerson, where in the first box we're talking about those things which are physical, and in the second box those things which are metaphysical. In the first box we can put a beautiful body, a beautiful face or body, and in the second box we would put the word beauty there. You can touch, you can see, you can relate to with your five senses everything in the first box, but you can't touch beauty. Give me a pound of joy. No. It does not the way that it works. Of course, for Emerson, the argument is simple. You have Ruthie's tree, and that goes in the first box, but then you have the energy of Ruthie's tree, and that goes in the second box. In the first box, we would call that nature with a small n, nature with a capital N in the second box. Nothing arbitrary, nothing artificial can endure. And then, and as he said in paragraph 13, in paragraph 12. In paragraph 13 to continue, everything is made of one hidden stuff, as the naturalist sees one type under every metamorphosis, and regards a horse as a running man, a fish as a swimming man, a bird as a flying man, a tree as a rooted man. And then he even uses the word energy a few lines later. Paragraph 14, the world globes itself in a drop of dew. This is, of course, Blake's observation that all of the world is contained in a grain of sand, right? And the idea, again, is simple. The microscope cannot find the animalcule which is less perfect for being little. Ears, eyes, taste, smell, motion, resistance, appetite. All of this, he says, is the true doctrine of omnipresence. The true doctrine of omnipresence is that God reappears with all his parts in every moss and cobweb. The value of the universe contrives to throw itself into every point. If the good is there, so is the evil. If the affinity, so the repulsion. If the force, so the limitation. Thus, paragraph 15, the universe is alive. All things are moral. That soul which is within us is a sentiment. Outside of us is a law. So in other words, he says it. The dice of God are always loaded. In other words, the argument that he's going to say is retribution. And he uses this word retribution. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Both in the physical world as well as in the spiritual world, or we might say the ethical or the moral world. Paragraph 16, you can see where this is headed. Every act then rewards and punishes itself. There is cause and effect. We think, of course, of our studies in Buddhism here, right? And he even uses the term crime and punishment grow out of one stem. We think of Dostoevsky's classic novel, Crime and Punishment. Paragraph 17, we have the impossible task outlined. Of course, we want the pleasure of the life we live without the pain. And he will say it this way in paragraph number 17. He says, the soul says, eat, the body would feast. The soul says, the man and woman shall be one flesh and one soul. The body would join the flesh only. In other words, you can see our focus is often just that first box from our earlier lecture. The soul says, have dominion over all things to the ends of virtue. The body would have the power over things to its own ends. In other words, there is a dialectic, a tension. If one can find harmony or balance between those two, then obviously one can live well. And therefore, there is always compensation. Let's pause for a moment, and we'll return to paragraphs 18 and 19 in a moment. Thank you.